The .NET Core podcast is supported by our listeners who have become patrons. To see a full list of the patrons, or to join them, head over to .NETCore.show/patrons. Hello everyone, and welcome to the .NET Core podcast, the only podcast which is devoted to .NET Core, ASP.NET Core, EF Core, Signal R, and not forgetting the .NET Core community itself. I am your host, Jamie Gaprogman Taylor, and this is episode 13, Continual Learning with Steve Gordon. In this episode, I talk with Steve about some of his deep dives into the .NET Core source code, continually learning, and giving great talks. You may know Steve from his incredibly deep dive blog posts on .NET Core, or the .NET Southeast meetup group which he started, or his work on the Humanitarian Toolbox. Check the show notes for links. So let's sit back, open up a terminal, type in .NET New Podcast, and let the show begin. So, Steve, thank you ever so much for agreeing to be on the podcast. I can't guarantee when this one will go out because of the magic of podcasts. You record them way in advance. This one, I'm thinking, will probably go out January, February time.
So, .NET Core 3.0 is probably out by now, hopefully.
Yeah, let's hope so. So, let's start by talking about .NET Core 3. No,
we can say what we want, and some of it may be true.
That's it, right? If we say it now, we hold Microsoft accountable. And if we don't provide the features, then we riot somehow. That might be a bit too extreme. For the extremely small number of listeners who haven't heard of you or seen any of your work, would you mind giving a short introduction?
Yeah, sure. So I like to start by saying that I'm a purely self-taught developer. So didn't study it at sort of university, did some stuff at college on it, but it's mostly self-taught. And I've been coding, I guess, for about 18 years in secondary school, but on and off. So playing around with things like Quick Basic. I think I then went on to VB6, eventually VBNet. And then I think moved to sort of C# and sort of web forms kind of development. And throughout that time, as I say, it wasn't my main job. It was mostly a hobby, and it was mostly something I like to do as a kind of like side projects, things like that. But in 2015, I took a bit of a career switch and moved over to professional development full time. Haven't really looked back since. It's been one of the great decisions I made in my life that I'm very pleased I did. So today I'm a senior developer. I work for a company called Magix. They're based in Brighton, so down on the south coast of the UK. Well, that's where the head office is, and that's where I'm sort of based. And we do, I guess, mostly recruitment-based software as a service products. So best known for our job board products and a range of stuff that we do there, used by customers like The Guardian and Washington Post to run their digital job boards. And so in the roles there for the last couple of years, at least, I've been mostly working with .NET Core and ASP.NET Core. So we started with that at Magix when it was in the RCs, where we were kind of hoping it was fairly stable, and it did still bite us during that early release phase. But it was a really nice decision. We had a greenfield project we were building for reporting and analytics. So we kind of dived in with .NET Core services, Docker, and all of the sort of fun new technologies that were available at the time. And more recently, I've been doing stuff with event source systems as well that we're kind of building out for some sort of data and machine learning products we're doing. I like to consider myself a continuous learner. So as I say, everything's self-taught as much as possible. And I just really enjoy learning, diving into development technologies and trying things out. But .NET Core and ASP.NET Core, I think, is where I spend most of my time. And on the side of that, I've sort of started blogging. I think it was early 2016. I finally committed to blogging properly after many false starts. And since then, I've been doing a lot of stuff on the blog, and then more recently, things like YouTube videos and public speaking, and just trying to share my passion out there with the community, really.
You are one of two developers I know who are lucky/unlucky enough to have started a greenfield project during the RCs of .NET Core. I can't even imagine what that must have been like. I know that I was playing with it, at home, personal projects. Oh, what can we do with this? What can we do with this? But I can't even imagine the coming into work and thinking, well, this library isn't stable enough, or this feature isn't stable enough.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it feels like it was I don't know, maybe a brave/reckless decision at the time, but we knew we had like a year of development on the project before we needed to be kind of pushing towards a live state. So we had the confidence that we would have enough time for the product to bed in a bit more. But certainly things like the Project JSON change that happened was a bit of a pain once you've got quite a few real world projects kind of all running in sort of like test environments, and you find that you have to change the project system that you're on top of. So yeah, it was fun times, but ultimately, it's paid off.
So on top of that, you run a very active .NET user group in the Brighton area. Could you tell us a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, so that was something the first meetup for that was about a year ago. So yeah, August last year, we had the first event. I've been, I guess, toying with the idea of a user group meetup event for about 3 or 4 months, kind of going back and forth on the idea of, I really want one of these things, but do I know what I'm doing to start one up? And we did already have a meetup in Brighton called Alt.net, which has been around for many years, and it's a very regular monthly event. But that's very much discussion based, and I enjoy going along to that. And it's a really nice way to kind of to chat about things with developers. But I was quite keen for the speaker led events that I'd sort of also been to. I'd been up to the London.net meetup and really enjoyed just kind of sitting down and having 45 minutes to an hour with someone just sharing their story. So yeah, I bit the bullet, got it running, and it really has gone far, far better than I expected. We've been lucky enough that the community in Brighton kind of found it. I put it on Meetup and I tried to promote it as much as I could over things like Twitter, and something worked. We had a number of people kind of coming along to the first event, and it's gone really well since then. We've had lots of local speakers coming along, which is really nice to see. It's really nice to have like the local community get engaged and not only come along to listen, but actually come and share, what they're doing, what they're learning about. We've also been lucky enough to have some sort of big names like Richard Campbell joined us for a hackathon that we ran, and then did, I think, about an hour and a half in the evening of kind of the history of .NET, which was a really entertaining night. We've also had John Galloway join us for an event, and this month we've got John Skeet coming as well. So we're already well onto the waiting list for the maximum number of people we can really fit into the space we've got. But it's been really fun kind of kicking it off, and we're always looking for new speakers, either from Brighton or those that are willing to kind of travel down to Brighton to come along and get involved. So if people are interested in coming along to try speaking, a user group is a great way to get started.
I just want to point out for the listeners, obviously, because of the time shift nature of the magic of podcasts, obviously the John Skeet event will have been and gone by the time this episode goes out, unfortunately. Yep. But no, that's really cool. You've got the big names. Obviously, you brought up Richard Campbell just then and the hackathon. I've seen that you contribute towards one of his projects, the Humanitarian Toolbox. Is there a kind of elevator pitch you can give for that you don't mind sharing with the listeners?
Yeah, sure. I'll shamelessly steal Richard's kind of elevator pitch that I heard him use the other day, which is that the Humanitarian Toolbox is primarily aiming to build open source software for disaster relief organizations. So think of the people like sort of Red Cross, Doctors Without Borders, those kind of organizations that are kind of responding to disasters. And what it comprises of really is a number of open source projects kind of under the umbrella of Humanitarian Toolbox that have been started up to work on various disaster related problem spaces. So the one I've been most involved with has been the Already project. And that project itself is specifically aimed at being quite a proactive tool for preparedness. So the idea is that trying to prepare in advance to either lessen the impact of potential disasters or ideally mitigate them entirely. So an example use case for that one would be what the American Cross were trying to use it for, which was to plan the deployment of free smoke alarms to homes around certain states in America. Because obviously, as we all know, having a smoke alarm in your house, if you do have a fire, there's a much higher chance of people surviving, getting out, unharmed or at least alive if they're alerted to it. So they're trying to put these fire alarms into people's homes where they don't have them and try and sort of reduce the risks there. So that's one of the use cases. And that's something that I've been involved with for about 2 years now, which has gone really quickly. And when I first started, that was my first ever time, I think, using GitHub. Probably browsed some repos, but I'd never ventured into the scary world of contributing to open source and putting my code out on the internet publicly. but I found it a really positive experience. It was a great way to get involved with open source by contributing time to something you kind of felt had a good cause, had a kind of nice humanitarian benefit at the end of it, rather than just yet another sort of blog engine, that kind of thing. And the team involved at the time, people like James Chambers, Simon Timms, Dave Paquette, there's sort of a bunch of MVPs there that are a really friendly bunch of guys that made it really easy to get started, helped with talking through the issues before you kind of get working on them, and then sort of reviewing your code in a very sort of positive way. So since then, I haven't really looked back. I've spent quite a bit of time contributing code there, and more recently getting involved with kind of helping do reviews and kind of guide some of the project directions. So yeah, it's a really, really good project that I would encourage people to check out. If you're new to open source and you want something friendly to start with, it's a good project to look for.
Is it a case of anyone can contribute, or is there like a wall somehow, like a system you have to agree to, or any kind of documentation? Or is it just literally a case of, I can go to the humanitarian toolbox on GitHub and look at an issue and maybe discuss it and then say, I think I can fix this, or I can help with this, and just submit a pull request?
Yeah, it's pretty much as easy as that. Yeah, we try to keep the barrier to entry as low as possible. So all of the issues are up on the Humanitarian Toolbox kind of organization on GitHub. So that's github.com/htbox. htbox is kind of a nice shortening that they've come up with to avoid people misspelling humanitarian. Mm-hmm. So you can go there, you can sort of dive through the different projects that are available. As I say, already is the one that I'm most familiar with. There's a huge number of issues that we've kind of built up after we kind of try and take business requirements off of like real organizations, real humanitarian organizations that can kind of give input as to how they would use the app and what features they would need. And then we try and break those down into a smaller, manageable chunk as we can. So, obviously open source is stuff that people do in their spare time. So we're kind of conscious that you can't sort of commit huge amounts of time in one go. So we try and make those issues something small and digestible that you can probably pick up. You don't have to learn the entire application to be able to kind of get involved. And as you say, if you're interested, just comment on the issue, say that you'd like to have a go at it. If you have any questions about how it should work or where to get started, it's easy enough just to leave a comment there. And then when you're ready to go, get the code and get ready to submit your PR. And I've got some videos actually on my YouTube channel that I kind of built with that in mind, to just kind of take people through the first steps of cloning from GitHub and preparing a pull request, that kind of thing. So that's up on my YouTube channel as well, if anyone's kind of new to open source and maybe Git in general.
So I was taking a look through your blog, and I can see that obviously your blog posts are really, I hope you don't mind me saying, that deep dives. You don't tend to compromise on the actual content. It's not like it's 4,000. I mean, this is something I have a problem with. I've written blog posts about some topic in .NET Core before, and it's been 4,000, 5,000 words. I've cut it back to maybe 3,000 and gone, should I really release that? And like I say, reading through mine, I get to the point where I get bored. But like reading through yours, it's like, I don't know how to describe it. It's like you present a problem that you've had, and then you'll just go, and here's the solution, but in chunks that are small enough to digest, and then you'll sort of discuss it as you go through. So I hope you don't mind me saying things like that, because it's really good example of how to write, I guess, a technical blog, but keeping it a little personal so you can actually pick up bits and pieces from it. When you tackle these subjects, are these subjects that you're actively looking into, that you're just going, I wonder how this technology works? Or are they more a case of, I've had this problem in the past 2 weeks or something, and here's how I solved it?
It's probably a 50-50 combination. Most of the time, I guess the topics start to evolve from things I'm working on, either at work or on sort of personal projects and things like that. So it tends to be things that I'm trying to do but can't find information readily on the internet already. And so as I'm solving the problem and tearing my hair out over many days or weeks, I kind of keep quite a lot of notes as I go. And then some of those evolve into blog posts. Some of them kind of, I decide actually there's nothing much there, but I also really enjoy just learning new things. I think you sort of mentioned that you're a voracious reader, and I think I'm the same. I kind of consume a lot of content. Sort of Twitter feed is constantly sending me new articles to read and things. So some of those piqued my interest in a new feature that's available in .NET Core, for example. And I'll go and find myself kind of peeking into how those work. And pretty much invariably, I keep digging. I always like to know what's below the surface. So once I've kind of worked out what the kind of maybe the public API is, I'm often sort of finding myself cloning down the repo and poking through the code to understand how things work. And I found that a really useful way of learning initially, learning new techniques, learning, when you have a problem with that feature, just having that slightly sort of under the surface look, even if you don't necessarily fully understand it, you can kind of get a better idea when something goes wrong, where you might need to look. So certainly some of those early deep dives that I did were, I think, around ASP.NET Core Identity, which was primarily, I think, because we were starting that new project, and we have a kind of set of security guidelines that we work to, and we sort of wanted to make sure that the framework was reliable and doing the right things. And at the time, it was, I think, definitely was around RC1, I think. So there wasn't much actual official documentation for any of these features. And so I found myself inside the identity source code, kind of looking at how the token providers worked in there, how they were sorting and hashing passwords, what kind of algorithms they were using there, just to make sure that it was going to meet our requirements and be robust enough. So that kind of started out as a kind of investigation for work. And as I kind of made more and more notes, I thought, actually, this might be interesting to other people. So that's what sort of triggered those early deep dives that I found myself doing. And then I kind of got a bit hooked on just finding time to dig into the internals of things like MVC. So I was quite curious how all of the middleware got kind of invoked and how that all sort of actually starts up under the hood, and what happens when you use MVC in the configuration method inside startup, all of that kind of stuff. Just curiosity, really. So I kind of dug through the code and tried to lay it out. And really pleased to hear that you've enjoyed the way it's written. It's always great to hear. So thank you. It's tough. I'm always super critical of my own work. So I'm never sure when I finish whether I've made it clear enough. And it's very much an iterative process for me in terms of, as I say, starting with those notes, then I start to form ideas of things I want to cover, and I try and figure out the story. So generally try and come up with a nice flow and code samples where I need them, and then put everything together and then read over it many, many times before I'm finally happy to hit the publish button. But I think for me, the blog started mostly as a kind of an aid to memory. I do find myself with a terrible memory, so I tend to kind of learn an API or how something works and then immediately disregard it because I've read about a bunch of new stuff. So for me, the blog posts are as much something I can find information in as they are something that's out there publicly. But I was quite keen to share that content because, if I was struggling with things, I was sure other people would be. And I guess that's one of the major benefits actually of .NET Core and ASP.NET Core that I think maybe some people forget about or are unaware of is that because it's now fully open source, anyone can go and pull down these repositories and take a look at how these things work and really understand the internals if they either need to or just have an interest in it. So yeah, I think that's kind of what led me down that path with many of those deep dive posts, certainly.
You brought up something I'm really quite interested in then when you said that, it's useful to know a little bit about, even if you don't know how the underlying technology works, just knowing that there's another layer. Because I believe it was Scott Hanselman. I remember him saying something along the lines of, it's worth every developer knowing a procedural, a functional, and a scripting language, and then taking it one step further and stepping down the chain to understand that, yes, okay, C# is built on a framework that talks to, if eventually your code is compiled down to IL. So knowing that it exists or understanding a little bit about that compilation process will help you to understand the decisions that were made in designing the language. And I think definitely the same can be said for any framework that you use, I mean, there's nothing wrong with being the developer who just goes foo.bar. Whatever and just calling the methods and chaining them together. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But I feel like in order to get a full understanding of the decisions that were made in building the code and the framework and the applications that you're using in that way, it's worth just even if you just peek under the surface. And even then, it can be a hugely educational experience going, oh, right, okay, so I can see that they use the builder pattern to create an instance of the web host builder. How does that work?
Yeah, I definitely recommend to all developers of all levels that, spending time reading code is a great way to learn new things. Like you say, you'll expose yourself to patterns and things almost by osmosis if you're doing that, because I guess typically most of us are working on, if we're lucky, a few new projects and things like that, but quite often sort of maybe older monolith projects, and you'll tend to find yourself reusing just what you're used to in that one project, if that's all you ever do. But as soon as you start reading other stuff and diving into other projects, you'll find little snippets of code that you think, oh, that's a really clever way of doing that. Like you say, you might find that the builder pattern is particularly suited to something, and you may not even know it's specifically a builder pattern. You just sort of saw some code and it made logical sense to kind of structure it that way. So I do think reading code is a really valuable exercise that certainly I enjoy doing it for that reason. As I say, I've not had a formal computer science education, so I always feel, I guess it's a level of imposter syndrome when I'm doing things like this, talking on podcasts or speaking. But I find that if I've spent more time reading code, then I certainly feel far more happy talking about things and explaining them to others as well.
If you think about it, the way that we learn to code is we read other people's code,
Yep.
Like when you're first starting, you don't know how to write hello world. You got to learn how to do it by reading how someone else wrote it.
Yep.
So it just makes sense that to continue that sort of continual learning path, you need to be reading what other people are doing and seeing how they're doing it, talking to other developers and figuring it all out, being in the community, as it were.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And I think we can all learn as well from, we joked earlier on about, the changes that happened during RC1 of ASP.NET Core. There was a lot of uproar. There was a lot of, I guess, anger and sort of controversy within the community about, oh, they're taking away this feature and we just got used to it and we liked that. But I think it's also interesting just to watch open source projects as big as something like, the .NET framework, to see that, we all have these problems at work, I'm sure, where, decisions get made and then later people regret them, or you have to change a direction because you learn something new about how that thing's going to be used. And so I think watching things like, these projects actually develop, just watching the issues, watching some of the pull requests can also be really educational, just to see that happens and to see how the team deal with it. I think the Microsoft team, the ASP.NET team and the .NET Core team have all been very, very open in terms of, when they do make mistakes, they're being very open about it, and they're engaging on Twitter with discussions and explaining the rationale. I think recently I've seen some stuff where Imo Landworth has been explaining some, I guess, mistakes that were made in terms of the way they decided to sort of retrospectively implement .NET Standard 2.0 in the .NET framework in 4.6.1. And they've realized that really didn't work very well. And it's interesting just watching the sort of discussions and seeing Imo's explanations for what they felt they did wrong and what they're going to try and do differently as they go forward, because I think we can all learn from each other's mistakes as well as we can sort of tutorials and other things like that.
Yeah, definitely. It's been fun watching I say fun. It's been educational and, yeah, I guess a little fun watching things like the ASP.NET community stand-ups and the community, I can't remember off the top of my head now what Imo calls his weekly.
The .NET Core design reviews, I think.
That's the one, yeah. Listening to, like you say, their rationale for we've designed it to work in this way, or we've tried it this way and we're going to try this way now. Because, I'm not that old. I went to uni in the early 2000s, so I can remember when Microsoft was all closed source and your only chance of learning about the new things before they happened was to somehow become an MVP and be invited to one of these events.
Yeah.
Whereas now, you can learn about it. I quite often sit on the train home on a Tuesday evening and I'll watch the .NET community stand-ups and I'm taking part. I'm sending messages and having answers, questions answered by people like John and Imo, and when they have Imo on, or Damien Edwards, it's strange to get that. Well, not strange. I think it's a new direction that they're going in, and it's really cool to see that instant feedback. And then you can take the ideas and the rationales for these changes, maybe put them into your own work or your own practice, and then figure out, oh yeah, no, that makes sense. The command pattern works better there, or generics works better here or something. And then it sort of, or if you, like you say, if you've never heard of a certain pattern, watching one of these or engaging in these conversations, you're like, oh wow, that's a thing that I should maybe learn about.
Yep. Yeah, it's definitely a great way just to expose yourself to different ideas, and you may use them, you may never pick them up again. But yeah, I think just putting yourself out there as much as you can just can only be a good thing, in my opinion.
You do a lot of public speaking as well as your YouTube channel and shows like this. But what would be your advice to someone who's decided, I want to give a talk on something, I want to get my name out there, I want to teach some people about some stuff? Is it best to maybe start at a local meetup for the incredibly confident people? Is it worth going straight to a big conference and saying, hey, I want to do this? Or would it be better to start like brown bag lunches at work? What would be having done it yourself, what would be your advice to someone who wanted to start down that sort of path?
I think it will definitely depend on your level of confidence, but I would suggest starting smaller, because it's not just about having the confidence. I think it's also about sort of developing a style and developing a skill set in order to kind of present something concisely. So I think diving straight in may work for some, certainly if you've sort of got more experience speaking generally in other environments. But, my personal experience was I only started public speaking about April last year. And if you'd asked me a year and a half ago if I'd ever sort of be on a stage somewhere speaking at an event, I would say, absolutely no way. You're crazy. Because I had a real, I guess, fear. I sort of almost refer to it as a hate feeling, I think, for the concept of having to stand up and speak, even in relatively small environments with a group of people I knew. And so it wasn't a natural choice, but I actually got into it because I wanted to try and promote the Humanitarian Toolbox and get more people involved in that. And I was attending at the time the Alt.net meetings locally that I referred to earlier, and they were having a kind of show and tell night, and they said, anyone that wants to do a 20-minute slot, let me know. And I put my name down and I thought, yes, I'm going to talk about Humanitarian Toolbox and it's all going to be fine. And then immediately regretted the decision, but stuck with it. And so I spent, I think I had a month or two to kind of put some content together, kind of started hashing out what I wanted to say, and in many places shamelessly stealing from Richard Campbell's talks that he'd given. I had spoken to him and checked he was happy with that first, but I kind of put together the content and ended up giving the talk, and it went, I think, pretty well. I was hugely nervous leading up to it, but it was probably a small group of maybe 25 of us, something like that, for that evening. So it looked terribly intimidating when I sort of stood up in front of everyone, but realistically, 25 or so is quite a nice number. It's big enough that it feels like you're presenting to a larger audience, but not too big that you've got too many eyes staring at you. And gave the talk, was pretty pleased with it, but I'm quite a perfectionist, so I'm always very critical of stuff. So I was immediately thinking, maybe that wasn't very clear. But I was kind of lucky, actually. On that particular evening, Dylan Beattie, who's probably a fairly well-known name in the .NET community, does a lot of conferences and things now. Dylan Beattie was there. He was doing a kind of 20-minute slot as well. He'd come down from London to join in the fun. And he sort of came up to me afterwards and said that he'd really enjoyed it. He thought it was, well presented. And hearing that from someone I knew as a presenter was quite encouraging. So that was good to hear. And he then suggested to me that evening, I think, that I should submit to his conference that he helps organize at Skills Matter in London. It's an event called Progressive.net. And he said, why don't you submit something for that? And I sort of said, well, I'm not sure, but I'll have a think about it. And then I think sort of spurred on by the leftover sort of energy from giving that talk, I actually put in a title and an abstract of some stuff I'd been thinking of sharing at work about Docker. And then I think a few months later got the email saying you've been accepted, and decided that I'd probably made a bad decision, because now I had to stand up in front of a proper conference. But it was quite nice. It's quite a fairly well-attended conference, but it's not it's not an NDC. So it was at least not going to have those weird stages that I hear about at the NDC conferences in Oslo. And so, I ended up doing that. Again, that went fairly well. I was following John Skeet, which was quite intimidating as a first-time speaker to have to follow John Skeet's great talks. But everything went to plan. I really, really enjoyed it, and actually realized that I wasn't feeling quite as nervous beforehand, and then sort of it's just kind of rolled from there. So the overall advice, I think, is definitely give it a try, even if you're like I was, which was thinking I hate public speaking, I really don't want to do it. I think try and find an environment where you feel comfortable enough to give it a go. So recently we had like a new speakers night for .NET Southeast. And we invited people to kind of give about a 15-20 minute talk if they wanted to, ideally kind of first timers from the local community. And we had 3 people kind of present talks on that event. And some of them were, much like me, very nervous beforehand, regretting the idea immediately, but found that they really enjoyed it. And at least a couple of them, I think, are planning to try and do longer talks somewhere else. So start small, find somewhere that you can try it out. If you don't like it, don't do it again. But if you find that you even have a slight enjoyment from doing it, then I recommend kind of keeping going with it. And it opens a lot of doors. It gets you access to conferences. I'm going to get to travel to Prague in November. My travel and expenses are paid. I get to attend the Update conference that they're hosting there for free because I'm going to be speaking. So, it's great from that perspective as well in terms of benefits to you because you get access to events that you might not normally travel to. It's great for the community because ultimately people go there to hear experiences, hear stories. You don't have to have a deep technical expertise in any one particular subject, I don't think. I certainly don't consider myself expert. I just share a story mostly. That's what I try and do with the talks that I've given so far is kind of, this is the problem we were facing. This is what we decided to do. This is what worked. This is what didn't, or we would do differently, that kind of thing, because no one can really challenge that kind of talk. So don't worry about people telling you you're wrong because it's your experience and it's your opinion about what you did and didn't do right. So it's a safer way to get involved than maybe just kind of standing up and saying, this is how you do C# correctly. And just find something like that, see if you enjoy it, and then hopefully it'll roll from there.
That's some really great advice. I have to say, as of the time of recording, I'd recently given a talk at a local WordPress meetup about using Docker to spin up a whole environment. It was a very developer-driven talk, but I know that of the 8 people that were there, I know that at least 4 of them weren't developers.
Right.
And what was really cool, I got really excited, and I'm jumping up and down and running around and telling jokes and doing magic tricks and stuff. And I'd said to them, don't bother taking notes because I'm going to give you the slide decks. And, there's paragraphs and paragraphs of stuff in each of the slide notes. So just chill, take it easy. There's a lot of content here, but I'm only going to breeze over it. And then the meetup afterwards, so the next month, I went along and someone came up to me and said, I saw your talk on Docker. And I thought it really, because my tagline was Docker is magic, because it kind of is.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm a .NET dev and I'm lazy, so I don't want to have to learn how to set up PHP and MySQL and WordPress and this and that and the other. I just want to push a button and have it work. And that was my goal. And someone had come up to me and said, I've been working with Docker and I found this really cool thing. We had this 20-minute conversation and I learned some stuff that, like, this person had never used Docker before. I'm not a brilliant Docker user, but I learned a whole bunch of stuff from them. They went away and did some research and learned this thing, and it's not, even in like an intimate setting of 8 to 10 people, you can still have that feedback of, oh, hey, have you tried doing this and have you done that? Obviously, I've not done it at the level you've done it at. It's soon, maybe, but it can benefit you as a learner as well, I think.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a two-way thing. I think one of the benefits that you can overlook as well is I think I said earlier, I feel I'm quite an introverted person, which is probably quite common in sort of developer space. And so if I'm at an event, if I'm at a conference or something as an attendee, I find it quite hard to necessarily introduce myself to people and kind of get involved. But if you go as a speaker, you will have people walk up to you after your talk and during the event, asking questions and engaging. So that immediately makes ice breaking a lot easier if they're doing it. And then you, as you say, you have these discussions and they'll ask questions and maybe share their opinions on things, and you'll go away with as many ideas as you took to the event just from having spoken to more people. It's the same with user groups as well. It's one of the things I love about sort of the .NET Southeast event is we get people from all around Brighton and surrounding towns, and they're from all different companies at all different levels of sort of .NET adoption. So some of them are on the full framework and some of them are on sort of the latest and greatest sort of .NET Core stuff. But everyone's kind of talking about what they're working on, the challenges they're facing, and you just have these really interesting discussions. And it's, as you say, it's a two-way thing. You don't just sort of spout a bunch of stuff at people for 45 minutes and go away kind of happy with yourself. You really get to learn yourself as well.
Yeah, definitely.
And people will ask really random questions potentially that you hadn't even considered. But even if you don't know the answer, I think it's best to say, if you don't know, you just don't know, that's fine. But, often that will spur me off to kind of go, oh, I'm going to research that when I get back.
That's it. Yeah, it's something that I do in job interviews. If someone asks you a question and you're like, oh, that is a very good technical question. And you're thinking to yourself, I don't know the answer. And what I'll do is I'll say, yeah, well, I don't know, but that's the first thing I'm going to do when I get out of here. The phone's going to come out and I'm going to look it up.
Yeah.
Because you've just poked a hole in my knowledge and I'm going to go fill it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely.
That's cool. Just real quick then, that's okay. So where can our listeners go to learn more about you and the things that you're doing in the community and all that kind of stuff?
Probably the best place to keep up with me generally is on Twitter. So I'm at Steve J. Gordon on Twitter. I'll post the stuff I'm working on and the posts I've written, things like that. I'll try and retweet a lot of the content that I read that I find useful. Keep up with me there. Then there's my blog. So that's stevejgordon.co.uk. You'll probably see a theme with the usernames and domains I'm trying to keep there. So that will be where I post fairly regularly. It's on average once a week, but sometimes it's like 2 or 3 in a week and then sometimes none. But I try and kind of keep it fairly regular. There's the YouTube channel I mentioned, and you can get to that youtube.stevejgordon.co.uk will redirect you there. Got a few conferences coming up, but those will be completely over by the time this comes out. So I won't sort of suggest coming to meet me at those, but hopefully next year I'll have some more events and things that I'll be signed up to do. So hopefully I'll sort of meet people there as well.
All that remains to say is to say thank you again, Steve, for being on the podcast. It's been a real pleasure, definitely. And I've learned a lot of things about maybe how I can go away and do talks to more than 8 people.
Well, thank you. Yeah, no, it's really, really, really fun. Thanks for inviting me on, and looking forward to listening to all of the other posts that come out beforehand.
Thank you very much, Steve. That was my interview with Steve Gordon. I'll be honest with you, shortly after we recorded this interview, I was bitten by the public speaking bug. I can't say for certain whether Steve's advice was directly responsible for it, but I feel like it was part of my decision to get up in front of folks and give talks about things that I'm passionate about. Be sure to check out the show notes for a selection of links and a collection of text snippets from this interview. The show notes, as always, can be found at .netcore.show. And don't forget to spread the word. Leave me a rating or a review on your podcatcher of choice, and to come back next time for some more .NET Core goodness. I'll see you again real soon. See you later, folks.